The Moretti estate stood like a fortress of elegance against the autumn sky, its stone walls draped in cascading white roses and golden ribbons that caught the afternoon light. Vincent Moretti adjusted his tie for the third time that hour, his weathered hands betraying the calm expression he wore for the hundreds of guests filling the manicured gardens. At 62, he had built an empire that stretched from the docks of Brooklyn to the penthouses of Manhattan, and today marked the union of his only daughter, Isabella, to Marco Santini, son of his oldest associate. The ceremony took place in the estate's historic chapel, where stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the polished marble floors. Isabella moved down the aisle with grace, her ivory gown trailing behind her like a river of silk. Vincent watched from the front row, surrounded by men whose loyalty had been tested through decades of difficult decisions and dangerous operations. These were men who understood the weight of tradition, the importance of family bonds that went deeper than blood. Marco waited at the altar, his dark suit tailored perfectly, his expression a mixture of pride and something else. Nervousness, perhaps, or anticipation. The young man had proven himself capable over the years, managing several legitimate businesses that served as the family's public face. Vincent had approved this match not just for love, though Isabella clearly cared for Marco, but because it strengthened alliances that kept their worlds stable. The priest's voice echoed through the chapel as he spoke of commitment and honor, words that carried different meanings for those gathered here. In their world, vows were sacred not because of religious doctrine, but because breaking them carried consequences that extended far beyond personal disappointment. Vincent's mind drifted momentarily to his own wedding 40 years earlier, when the city had been different, when the rules of engagement were clearer. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved toward the grand ballroom for the reception, Vincent felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Thomas, his consigliere for 25 years, a man whose counsel had saved them from disaster more times than either cared to count. Thomas leaned close, his words barely audible above the congratulatory chatter surrounding them. "Boss, something arrived. You need to see this before we go inside." Vincent followed Thomas to a small study off the main corridor, away from the celebration's noise. On the desk lay a cream-colored envelope, unmarked except for his name written in careful script. The handwriting struck him immediately. It belonged to someone from another time, someone he hadn't thought about in years. He opened it carefully, extracting a single card with words that made his blood run cold. "The foundation of your empire was built on betrayal. Tonight everyone will know what you did to Antonio Russo in 1998. The truth cannot stay buried forever." Vincent's jaw tightened as he read the message twice, then a third time. Antonio Russo had been his partner once, his closest friend, until circumstances had forced an impossible choice. The official story was that Antonio had relocated to Italy, retired from the business. Only 3 people knew the real truth, and 2 of them were dead. Thomas watched his boss's face carefully, recognizing the shift in his expression. "What does it say?" Vincent handed him the card without speaking. The celebration continued beyond the study's walls. Music started playing, glasses clinked in toasts, laughter echoed through the ballroom. But in this small room, the 2 men stood in silence, understanding that the evening ahead had just become far more complicated than a simple wedding reception. "Who could know about this?" Thomas finally asked, his voice low and serious. Vincent moved to the window, looking out at the estate grounds where security personnel maintained their discreet positions among the hedges and pathways. "That's what we need to find out. Quickly, before whoever sent this decides to make good on their threat." The sounds of celebration seemed distant now, almost mocking. Vincent had spent decades building legitimacy, creating distance between the family's current operations and the darker actions of the past. Isabella's wedding was supposed to symbolize that transformation, a new generation stepping into a cleaner, safer world. But the message in his hand suggested that the past was not as buried as he had believed. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across tables draped in cream linens and centerpieces of white orchids. 500 guests mingled, their conversations creating a constant hum beneath the live orchestra's music. Vincent moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations and well wishes while his mind worked through possibilities, cataloguing faces and searching for anything unusual. Isabella and Marco opened the dancing, moving together with a synchronization that came from weeks of practice. Vincent watched them with genuine affection, remembering when his daughter had been small enough to stand on his shoes while they danced in the living room. She deserved happiness, deserved a life free from the complications that had defined his own path. The message in his pocket felt like a weight, threatening to pull everything down. Thomas had already put their most trusted people on alert, instructing them to watch for anything suspicious without causing alarm among the guests. The security team moved with increased vigilance, checking credentials more thoroughly, paying attention to anyone who seemed out of place. But in a gathering this large, with guests ranging from legitimate business partners to family members with complicated histories, identifying a threat was like finding a specific thread in an elaborate tapestry. Vincent joined a table where several older associates sat with their wives, men who had been part of the organization for decades. They talked about the ceremony, about how beautiful Isabella looked, about Marco's good fortune in marrying into the family. Normal conversation, the kind that happened at every wedding. But Vincent found himself studying each person, wondering if any of them harbored resentment deep enough to send that message. Carlo Benedetti, who had worked alongside Antonio Russo years ago, seemed particularly jovial tonight. He raised his glass repeatedly, telling stories about the old days with a nostalgia that could be genuine or could be something else entirely. Vincent made a mental note to have Thomas look into Carlo's recent activities, his financial situation, his associations. The first course arrived, a delicate soup served in fine china, and conversation shifted to the food, the venue, the orchestra's skill. Vincent barely tasted what he ate, his attention divided between maintaining appearances and processing the implications of the threat. If someone truly intended to expose what had happened to Antonio, the consequences would extend far beyond personal embarrassment. It could trigger investigations, crack open carefully maintained legal protections, put everyone in danger. Isabella approached his table, radiant in her happiness, and bent to kiss his cheek. "Papa, thank you for all of this. Everything is perfect." He smiled, taking her hand. "You deserve nothing less, sweetheart. You and Marco have a wonderful life ahead." She squeezed his fingers before returning to her new husband's side, and Vincent felt a surge of protective determination. Whatever game the message sender was playing, it would end tonight. He would not allow his daughter's future to be poisoned by his past actions. The orchestra transitioned to a livelier tune, and more couples moved onto the dance floor. Vincent excused himself from the table, making his way toward the terrace where Thomas waited with two other senior members of the organization, Michael Costa and Robert "Bobby" DeLuca. These were the men he trusted most, the ones who had proven their loyalty through actions, not just words. "Any progress?" Vincent kept his voice low, aware that sound carried strangely in the night air. Michael shook his head. "We've checked everyone on the entry list twice. No one stands out as suspicious. Everyone here had a proper invitation, proper credentials." "What about staff?" Bobby suggested. "Caterers, musicians, service people. Someone could have slipped in with one of those crews." Thomas had already considered this. "We're reviewing that now, but the companies we hired have all worked for us before. They know the expectations, know what happens if security is compromised." Vincent turned to look back through the terrace doors at the celebration continuing inside. Hundreds of people eating and drinking and dancing, unaware that something dark lurked at the edges of their joy. Somewhere among them, or watching from nearby, was someone who knew about Antonio Russo, someone who had waited years to use that knowledge as a weapon. Antonio had family, Vincent said quietly. A son, maybe 20 at the time. We made sure they were taken care of financially, but people don't always appreciate that kind of compensation. Thomas pulled out his phone, typing quickly. Dominic Russo. I'll find out where he is now, what he's been doing. The music inside swelled to a crescendo, and guests applauded. Through the windows, Vincent could see Isabella and Marco cutting their wedding cake, smiling for the photographer's camera, creating memories that should have been purely happy. He thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, all the compromises and calculations that had seemed necessary at the time. Antonio Russo had been more than a partner. He had been family in every way that mattered, but he had also become a liability, making decisions that threatened everyone's safety, refusing to listen to reason. The choice Vincent had made that night in 1998 had haunted him ever since, but he had told himself it was the only option, that protecting the many meant sacrificing the one. Now, 27 years later, someone wanted to turn that sacrifice into a weapon. Midnight approached, and the celebration showed no signs of slowing. The orchestra had been replaced by a DJ who played music that got younger guests onto the dance floor, their energy infectious even among the older crowd. Vincent maintained his position near the bar, nursing a glass of scotch that he had barely touched, watching everything with the careful attention of someone who had spent a lifetime reading situations and people. Thomas returned from making calls, his expression grim. Dominic Russo is in the city. He arrived 3 days ago from Chicago, where he's been living under a different name. He's been asking questions about the family, about you specifically. My contact says he's been talking to some people who remember the old days. Vincent absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally he felt pieces falling into place. Dominic would have been 23 in 1998, just starting to understand the business his father had been involved in. The official story had been carefully constructed. Antonio relocating to Italy, staying in touch through occasional phone calls that Vincent's people had faked for the first year, before claiming Antonio had died in a car accident abroad. Dominic had received a generous settlement, money that should have secured his silence and his departure. But grief and guilt had their own mathematics, calculations that didn't always align with practical considerations. If Dominic had spent 27 years believing his father abandoned him to start a new life, only to discover recently what really happened, the anger would be immense, the desire for exposure or revenge overwhelming. "Is he here tonight?" Vincent asked, scanning the crowd with renewed focus. "We haven't confirmed that yet, but we found something else." Thomas handed over his phone, showing a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Antonio, the same sharp features, the same intense eyes. "This was taken by our security camera at the service entrance 2 hours ago. He was wearing a catering company uniform." Vincent studied the image carefully. Dominic Russo, hiding among the staff, moving through his daughter's wedding with a message that threatened everything. The question now was what the young man intended to do beyond sending the note. Exposure alone would be damaging, but if Dominic wanted more direct confrontation, more dramatic revelation, the situation could turn dangerous quickly. "Find him," Vincent said quietly. "Bring him to the wine cellar, discreetly. No scenes, no drama that would upset Isabella." As Thomas moved away to coordinate the search, Vincent felt the weight of his years pressing down. He had built so much, protected so many people, created legitimate businesses and opportunities that employed hundreds of families. But foundations built on difficult choices always carried cracks, weak points where pressure could cause collapse. He thought about Antonio again, about their last conversation in a warehouse near the docks. His friend had been defiant, convinced he was right, unwilling to accept that his actions had put everyone at risk. Vincent had tried reasoning, had offered alternatives, had practically begged for compromise. But Antonio had been stubborn, and in their world, stubbornness was often fatal. The decision to eliminate his friend had not been made lightly or quickly. Vincent had consulted with others, had explored every other option, had lost sleep for weeks before finally accepting what seemed inevitable. Even then, he had made sure it was quick, painless, that Antonio never saw it coming. Small mercies in a situation that allowed for none. Now Antonio's son wanted justice, or revenge, or simply acknowledgement of the truth. Vincent understood the impulse. If someone had taken his father, he would have burned the world to find answers. But understanding didn't change the necessity of containment. Dominic's desire for truth threatened Isabella's future, threatened the stability that hundreds of people depended on, threatened to undo decades of carefully constructed legitimacy. Across the ballroom, Isabella laughed at something Marco whispered to her face glowing with happiness. She had been kept separate from the darker aspects of the family business, educated at good schools, encouraged to pursue her own interests. She knew her father was powerful, that people respected and sometimes feared him, but she didn't know the specific actions that had secured that power. Vincent had wanted it that way, had worked to give her innocence even while operating in a world that allowed for very little. Bobby appeared at his elbow, speaking quietly. "We found him in the kitchen area. Thomas is bringing him down now." No one noticed. Vincent nodded, finishing his scotch and setting the glass aside. "I'll be down in 5 minutes. Make sure the area is secure." He moved through the crowd one more time, stopping to chat briefly with guests, checking on Isabella to ensure she needed nothing. She hugged him enthusiastically, thanking him again for the beautiful wedding, for giving her this perfect day. He held her a moment longer than usual, memorizing the feeling of her happiness, her trust, her love. Then he made his way toward the wine cellar, descending stone steps that led beneath the estate's main structure. The temperature dropped as he went deeper, the sounds of celebration fading until only silence remained. Thomas and Bobby waited outside a heavy wooden door, their expressions serious. "He's inside," Thomas said. "Not armed, not combative. He's been waiting for this conversation." Vincent entered the cellar, where racks of expensive wine lined walls of ancient brick. Dominic Russo sat in a chair in the center of the room, his catering uniform incongruous in the elegant space. He looked up as Vincent approached, and for a moment it was like seeing Antonio again, the same defiant intelligence, the same unwillingness to back down. "Dominic," Vincent said quietly, "we need to talk about your father." The wine cellar's cool air carried the faint scent of oak and aging grapes, a peaceful contrast to the tension filling the space. Dominic Russo watched Vincent approach with eyes that held neither fear nor hatred, but something more complicated, a mixture of determination and exhaustion that came from carrying heavy knowledge for too long. "You killed him," Dominic said simply. "Not an accusation, but a statement of fact. 27 years ago, you made him disappear, and you've been lying about it ever since." Vincent pulled another chair over, sitting so they faced each other at eye level. Respect, even in confrontation, mattered. "Your father was my closest friend, my brother in every way except blood. What happened that night was not something I wanted. It was something I had to do." "Had to do," Dominic repeated, his voice bitter. "That's what powerful people always say when they choose violence over compromise. You had to do it. You had no choice. But somehow you're still alive, still wealthy, still celebrating, while my father has been dead for nearly 3 decades. Vincent recognized the anger, understood its roots. He had felt similar rage when his own mentor had been taken by rivals, that burning need for someone to account for the loss. But time and experience had taught him that most situations contained more complexity than anger allowed for. Your father made choices that endangered everyone. He started working with people outside our organization, sharing information that put families at risk. When I found out, I tried to talk to him, tried to make him understand the danger. He refused to listen. He said things were changing, that the old ways didn't apply anymore. But in our world, betrayal has always carried the same consequence. Dominic leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. So you decided he had to die. You, alone, making that choice for everyone. Not alone. I consulted with others, with people who had as much to lose as I did. The decision was unanimous. Your father had become a threat we couldn't contain any other way. Vincent paused, choosing his next words carefully. I made sure it was quick. He never knew it was coming. And I made sure you and your mother were provided for financially, that you had opportunities he would have wanted you to have. Blood money, Dominic said quietly. Every dollar I spent, every opportunity I had, built on the lie that my father abandoned us. Do you know what that did to my mother? She died thinking he chose another life over her, over me. She died believing she hadn't been enough to keep him. That guilt destroyed her more surely than any physical illness. The weight of that revelation settled over Vincent like a physical presence. He had considered many consequences of his actions that night in 1998, but the psychological damage to Antonio's family had been something he'd tried not to think about too deeply. Necessary evil, he had told himself, acceptable casualties in a war that demanded difficult choices. But sitting across from Antonio's son, seeing the genuine pain in eyes so much like his old friends, the justifications felt thinner than they once had. I'm sorry, Vincent said, and meant it. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better. But I can't change what happened, and I can't let you expose it now. Too many people depend on the stability we've built. Too many families would suffer if that foundation cracked. Dominic nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. I know. I've spent 3 days watching your organization, seeing how many people work for you, how many families rely on the businesses you control. I'm not naive enough to think my desire for justice outweighs all of that. Then why come here tonight? Why send the message? Because someone needs to acknowledge the truth. Because my father's life mattered, and the lie about what happened to him has haunted me my entire adult life. Because I needed to look you in the eye and know whether you felt any remorse at all. Vincent met his gaze steadily. I feel remorse every day. Your father was one of the best men I ever knew, despite the mistakes he made at the end. Not a week goes by that I don't think about him, about whether there might have been another way. But remorse doesn't change necessity, and necessity doesn't erase responsibility. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of celebration distant but still audible through the stone walls above them. Two men connected by death and secrets, by choices made and consequences endured, trying to find some way forward that didn't require more violence, more loss. What happens now? Dominic finally asked. Vincent considered the question carefully. He could have the young man eliminated. It would solve the immediate problem, ensure the secret stayed buried. But looking at Antonio's son, seeing the intelligence and strength that reminded him so much of his old friend, he found he didn't want more blood on his hands. Enough people had paid for that night in 1998. You leave New York tonight, you go back to Chicago, to your life there, and you don't come back. You don't talk about what you know, don't try to expose what happened. In return, I'll tell you the truth, all of it. Every detail about that night, about the choices your father made and why they left me with no other options. You'll have the knowledge you came for, the acknowledgement that he mattered, that his death wasn't casual or cruel. And you'll have my word that if you ever need help, if you ever face trouble you can't handle alone, you can call on me. Antonio's son will always have that claim. Dominic stared at him for a long time, processing the offer. It wasn't justice in any traditional sense. There would be no trial, no public accounting, no official record of what had happened. But it was acknowledgement, truth, and a strange form of protection. The best resolution available in a situation with no good answers. Tell me, Dominic said finally. Tell me everything. Vincent did. He spoke for nearly an hour, describing his friendship with Antonio, their rise through the organization together, the decisions that had gradually driven them apart. He explained about the FBI investigation that Antonio's outside contacts had nearly triggered, about the intercepted communications that proved information was being shared. He described the meeting where they had tried one last time to reach agreement and Antonio's refusal to see reason. He told Dominic about making the decision, about the 3 days he had spent hoping for some other solution before accepting the inevitable. He described the night itself with clinical precision, the location, the method, the disposal of evidence. He admitted his own role directly, not hiding behind euphemisms or organizational necessity, taking full responsibility for ordering and overseeing his friend's death. When he finished, tears tracked down Dominic's face, though his expression remained steady. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me the truth, even if it doesn't change anything." Vincent stood, extending his hand. After a moment, Dominic took it. No forgiveness passed between them. That would have been too much to ask or offer. But there was understanding, acknowledgement, an agreement that this chapter would now close. Thomas arranged for Dominic's discreet departure, ensuring he reached the train station safely with enough money to start over somewhere new. Vincent returned to the celebration, where Isabella and Marco were saying goodbyes to guests who needed to leave. His daughter hugged him again, thanking him for the perfect wedding, for the beautiful start to her new life. Vincent held her close, grateful that she would never know how close perfection had come to shattering, how many difficult choices had been made to give her this moment of pure happiness. Some truths were better left buried, not because they didn't matter, but because protecting the future sometimes required protecting people from the past. As the last guests departed and the staff began cleaning up, Vincent stood alone on the terrace, looking out at the estate grounds. Antonio Russo's ghost would always walk here, a reminder of friendship betrayed by necessity, of choices that left scars no amount of time could fully heal. But tonight, at least, his old friend's son had received truth, acknowledgement, and release from the burden of not knowing. It wasn't redemption, but in their world, it was as close as anyone got.